So another important BFO term is sites. And an example of a site is this room here. A site is basically some kind of a hole in which, for instance, an organism can exist. So sites are an important way of describing the niches that organisms inhabit, such as rabbit holes or caves or nostrils or other orifices of the body. This is a site. This is the Manhattan Canyon. You can drive through it. You can also live overlooking it. What this picture reveals is that when we use the word Manhattan, we're actually using it in a number of different ways. So on the one hand, Manhattan may be a large collection of bricks and rocks and concrete and so forth. It might have a mass, for instance. But on the other hand, Manhattan may be a complex site which consists of all kinds of rooms and streets and entryways, and it's a place where people live and move. And in that sense, Manhattan is not a material entity. It's a site, a very, very complex site. And then there is the extended Manhattan, which would include both of those things. And this ambiguity holds not just for place names, it holds for virtually any kind of entity which organisms can be living in or on or around. So you can get into your bed. That means you're getting into the site created when you raise the bed sheets and insert your body between the bed sheets and the bed. Or you can jump up and down on your bed, and then your bed is just a material entity. And the same applies to your car and so forth. So we were running through Manhattan. That's a site. Manhattan is full of places to meet. That's a site. Manhattan has been being built since 1620. That's a material entity, and so on. Now, we have sites on the one hand, and we have 3D spatial regions. And some people think that sites are really just 3D spatial regions. But the reason why we need to distinguish between these two is that sites can move through space. So the cargo hold of a ship, when the ship moves across the sea, moves. So this very same site is now in this spatial region and now in that spatial region. And so the distinction rests upon having some sort of frame of reference which is held fixed, while the site-containing entity, the ship or the nostril or whatever it might be, moves through that frame of reference. And one of the lacunae of BFO at this stage is that we still haven't documented the role of frames of reference for both spatial regions and temporal regions. For temporal regions, it's pretty easy because the frames of reference are what we use anyway. They're things like midnight and calendar time and years. For spatial regions, we very rarely need to document the frame of reference that we're using because we're almost always not referring to spatial regions at all. We're referring to sites. But where we do need to document the frame of reference, we use latitude and longitude, or we might divide some experimental setup for plant growth evaluation by dividing up a field into rectangles. And in that case, we are talking about spatial regions rather than about sites. Now we have a protein site ontology. So this is part of a study of post-translational modifications. And when we're studying those things, we need to have ontological terms for all of those kinds of entities. But then we also need a term for the place, the location where the modification takes place. And so it might be there. The M, little m stands for a modification. That place is then a site in BFO terms. And it turns out that the protein site ontology opens up all kinds of promising ways of describing not just protein structure, but also behaviors of proteins when transformations take place, or modifications take place. And different kinds of sites can be distinguished then. And this is a rough draft of the site ontology as we had it, and now we need to move to a different kind of entity, which is information entities. So we've talked about specifically dependent continuants, which are qualities, roles, and dispositions. So it's qualities, roles, and dispositions. The feature of these things is that they cannot migrate from one bearer to another. You cannot have my headache. You cannot have my shape. You might have an exactly identical shape, but it's still your shape, and it's still different from my shape. But now there are what we call generically dependent continuants, which are basically copyable patterns. And they're important because all of life is based upon the existence of copyable patterns called sequences. But PDF files are copyable patterns. Any kind of information artifact in a computer, or indeed in a printed document, are copyable patterns. That's what printing is. And so the feature of generically dependent continuants is that they always require a bearer, just as specifically dependent continuants do, but they don't require the same bearer. They can hop from one bearer to another. And so this is a list of examples of information objects which have this feature. And plans, laws are information objects which have this feature. Plans in your head, the protocol that your research team is realizing, and so forth. And the score of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is an information object. It can exist either as a paper document, which is a material information object, or it can be a body of content, a set of instructions, and then it's a generically dependent continuant. It's a pattern of instructions. And then if I listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and if I have a really good musical memory, I could have a copy of that pattern somehow in my head. And if I could whistle a symphony, then I could whistle that pattern in my head, and you would have a copy of the pattern in my head in your head. And we can do that for simple melodies, of course. And that's what we do when we speak. We communicate information content entities from one person to another. We bring about copying from one brain to another brain. All right, so generically dependent continuants can be in the realm of paper or silicon or neurons or in some other medium. Smoke, I guess. And what happens is that they get concretized. So a generically dependent pattern becomes concretized as a specifically dependent pattern. So the pattern of neurons in my head, which is not something I can communicate, is mine. It's owned by me. It can't migrate to someone else. I can send out the information content, but I can't send out the neural structure. There's no way you can copy that. And so we distinguish between generically dependent continuants, information content entities, and the concretizations of information content entities when people read a text or examine an image, or when an image is printed so that we get a physical copy. That is a specifically dependent pattern on a piece of paper, which is a concretization of the generically dependent pattern, which could be copied from one computer to another. So concretization is making a specifically dependent continuant pattern out of a generically dependent continuant pattern. And this person in filling in this form now is creating a concretization of the information content which goes in that particular box that the entry is being made in on the form. So the same data or the same datum can exist in many concretizations. We may print out 100 copies of a database on 100 different sheets of paper, or make 100 different Excel files in 100 different computers of the same data. So that's where generically dependent continuants go. it's a sibling of specifically dependent continuant, and there are two major types. These are not terms in BFO now. These are just examples of subtypes of generically dependent continuant. And in science, of course, there are many of these things. And telephone numbers, credit card numbers are information entities in this sense. And if we go back to the oboe foundry, IAO and OB are full of information artifacts. But the realm of molecules and diseases and anatomy and so forth, there are no information artifacts at all. And the relation between the ontologies, the blue on the right and the yellow, orange, and green on the left, is aboutness. So the information content entities on the right are about, for instance, the biological entities on the left. So I don't think we need this. This is how the information artifact ontology looks in BioPortal. I take it you're all familiar with BioPortal. So an information artifact is an artifact which is an entity created deliberately, which endures through time. So, and an information artifact is an artifact that can be the bearer of information. And then there are two kinds: material information artifacts, such as hard drives or passports, and information content entities, which are generically dependent continuants. And then IAO was developed because OB needed a controlled vocabulary for describing all the information artifacts that are created through investigations. And we figured, well, things like footnotes, everyone needs them, not just people doing biological investigations. And so we created a more general ontology called IAO. And the purpose is not to replace metadata standards like Dublin Core. It's to provide an ontology which will fit with OB and Go and Pro and the other oboe foundry ontologies. Some information artifacts are descriptive. A piece of journalism, a scientific text, describes something. Other information artifacts are prescriptive. So a legal code, a license, they tell you what you can do. Other information artifacts are directive. They tell you what you have to do. So an instruction, an order, command, these are all directive information artifacts. And we have developed an ontology of these different kinds of information artifacts based on an ontology of the purposes. So directive, designative, and so forth. We talked already about the individual quality pattern on a specific hard drive or on a specific piece of paper, and that concretizes the information content entity, which the quality pattern is a quality pattern of. So the pixels on my screen, which also correspond to the quality pattern on that screen over there, are concretizations of one and the same generically dependent continuant quality pattern, which is also on that screen and that screen. I will now come to the question of the relationship between information content entities and universals. Tolstoy writes War and Peace. That means, and sends it to the publisher, immediately becomes publishable, it becomes copyable. So almost from the very beginning of the manuscript, there is a generically dependent continuant, an information content entity, very long, which is concretized in a very long sequence of ink marks created by Tolstoy. And that long sequence gets copied then by the printer, and then you have copies of the book. Each copy of the book is an instance of the universal book. So when you buy a copy of War and Peace, you're buying an instance. Somebody, according to traditional views of universals, and I'm doing philosophy now, for which I apologize, universals are ideal forms which exist and which get instantiated, for instance, on this planet. So there is the ideal form organism, there is the ideal form cell, there is the ideal form red, and so on, and they tend to be rather simple. Now, Tolstoy's War and Peace is not a rather simple ideal form. It looks very much like a creation, like something that Tolstoy made, and that he adjusted finest detail and created this gigantic detailed thing. I think that is an instance. The reason why it looks like a universal is because it's copyable. But I don't think that copyability implies that we have a universal on our hands. A car is, I think, in the market for being a universal. I would not object if people said that car was a universal. And then there are instances of that universal, which are this car and that car. It's certainly not an information content entity, it's physical. But now, if we say the 1936 Cadillac 461 with the special 7 wheels, then that's probably not a universal, even if there are 7 copies. Because it's not just complex, it's also, it's too obviously something created by man rather than found in the universe and then documented in scientific law specifications, for instance. In fact, I can go back to what I said earlier. The universals which are captured in ontologies are, in first approximation, that which is represented by a general term used in the formulation of scientific laws. A universal is the kind of thing which is represented by a general term used either in a scientific law or in some highly general theory or in some counterpart of a highly general theory created in a catalogue of kinds of utensil or kinds of machine or in kinds of military operation or whatever it might be. So we have lots of those catalogues. We don't have lots of instances of war and peace. We only have one. They're all war and peace. We have many instances of the kind copy of war and peace. But we don't have many instances of war and peace. We have many instances of the kind copy of the American Constitution, but we don't have many instances of the universal American Constitution, as is proven by the fact, and this is argument number 4 against the Herndorf temptation, which is that we don't say American constitutions. It sounds ungrammatical. We don't say wars and peaces. We just say war and peace. It's one thing created by Tolstoy. This is BFO-ISO. We've talked about sites. Let's talk a little bit about points, lines, and surfaces. So, first of all, we want BFO to be consistent with physics. As we understand it, there are no perfect surfaces in physics. Every physical surface, when you examine it microscopically, turns out not to be a surface. But we live in a world which, at the level of granularity of ordinary perception, is full of surfaces. And so they are what we call fiat surfaces. They are surfaces which it is convenient to regard as being physically perfectly flat, but which are in fact not physically perfectly flat. So that's why we have fiat surfaces in our account of spatial regions. All the boundaries in BFO are fiat boundaries. These fiat boundaries occupy spatial regions. So a zero-dimensional fiat boundary, which we're now calling a fiat point, occupies a zero-dimensional spatial region. A fiat line occupies a one-dimensional spatial region, and a fiat surface occupies a two-dimensional spatial region. And now every site occupies a three-dimensional spatial region, just as every material object occupies a three-dimensional spatial region. So this is a picture of the BFO relation of occupies. And similarly, on the side of processes, process boundaries occupy zero-dimensional temporal regions, just as processes occupy one-dimensional temporal regions. And now we distinguish amongst independent continuants between material entities on the one hand and immaterial entities on the other hand. Immaterial entities are sites, boundaries, and spatial regions. And material entities are objects, fiat object parts, and object aggregates. Material entities always have mass. Immaterial entities do not have mass. Fiat object parts are things like your arm and my leg. They are not objects because they do not have complete boundaries. Objects have complete boundaries, and they are joined together within those boundaries by physical forces. And examples of objects are organisms, lumps of granite, and laptops. And if you tear your laptop into two by ripping off its screen, you have two objects. You yourself are an object, but you're full of other objects. All the cells in your body are objects. But your head is a fiat object part. It's not an object, at least currently. All right, so these are objects. These are examples. These are the siblings of objects. These are fiat objects. And this is an object aggregate. Now, an object aggregate is not a sum of objects. It's a set. It's like a set. So there are no parts to this object aggregate other than the three apples. So object aggregates depend upon a certain granular view of reality. And then history. BFO has the term history. The history is just a sum of all the processes taking place in the spatial temporal region occupied by the entity which it is the history of. So Ringo's history would be the sum of all the processes in which inside Ringo's spatial envelope, from the beginning of Ringo's existence to the end of Ringo's existence.